Hi. Tonight, the National Baseball Hall of Fame will release the results of this year's voting and determine who, if anyone, is elected to Cooperstown. By a wide margin, this is the most controversial ballot of all time, with numerous candidates linked to doping, domestic violence, and other crimes. So in this video, I will give you everything you need to know ahead of tonight's announcement. Before we get into this, I'd really appreciate if you like this video and maybe even consider subscribing. And in case you want something specific, here are the timestamps for every topic I'm going to cover. This is the Hall of Fame ballot this year. The names in italics are appearing for the first time. The names underlined on the ballot are appearing for the 10th and final time. All of these players are strong candidates, by the way, but to this point they have not been voted in. We will discuss the reasons why later. Let's talk about the basics of the Hall of Fame. First of all, how does the voting work? Well, it's done by an association of sports writers numbering about 400. Any player receiving 75% of the vote gets in. Any player receiving under 5% of the vote is out. And any player in between, which is most of the guys we're going to be talking about, will continue to be considered for up to 10 years, and after that, their only chance is the Veterans Committee. How big should the Hall of Fame be? Well, that's a contentious question. A writer can vote for up to 10 spots, and many use all 10. Some use only a few, and others, like Stephen Marcus, submit blank ballots. Due to many ridiculous Veterans Committee inductions in the mid-20th century, the Hall of Fame is a bit skewed, such that recent decades are relatively less represented than the first half of the 1900s. So should we try to uphold an extremely selective Hall standard? Or should we open up the doors based on previous inductions? Shockingly, I'd actually say the Writers Association has done a good job of keeping it exclusive over the years, and it's more the Veterans Committees and the cronyism of people like Frisch, Terry, and La Russa that have actually been messing things up. Evaluating players across history is one of the fun things fans and writers love to do, and that's the joy of the Hall of Fame ballot. Baseball players can be ranked by all-encompassing metrics like WAR, VORP, or win shares. The problem is these numbers are still based on somewhat subjective components and sometimes disagree. Generally, the Hall of Fame line for players seems to be about 65 B WAR, maybe slightly less than that in F WAR, and probably a little over 300 win shares. But sometimes players are right on the border and you have to make tough decisions. Sometimes you have to make a judgment call about whether you value quiet excellence or whether you value a role in history. Now, let's get to the elephant in the room. These four guys are on their last ballot, and they are all strong candidates, but they're going to fall off the ballot in this year because of certain, let's say, transgressions. What are these transgressions? Well, I'm going to put them in two categories, the first being use of PEDs and the second being personal conduct. Before delving into these categories, let's talk about the voting guideline. This is what the writers are instructed to consider. As you can see, it does say character, integrity, and sportsmanship should be taken under consideration, but it's extremely vague, and that's one of the reasons this discussion is so difficult. In 1991, Major League Baseball banned steroids. However, they had no enforcement whatsoever, and so as the turn of the millennium approached, steroid use became rampant. In the early 2000s, facing enormous outside pressure, baseball finally took action and instituted drug testing, although many players still continue doping and have been suspended for it. The degree to which PED use is tolerated depends entirely on the sport. In the Olympics, it's a terrible sin and you can get banned for years. In open bodybuilding, it's expected and all serious competitors do it. In other sports, the mood is somewhere in between. Since MLB had nothing but the honor system until the early 2000s, in my opinion, the problem was much more the fault of those running the game than those competing in it. As I demonstrated in a previous video, I think a whole bunch of steroid users are already in, and meanwhile, cheaters of many other kinds have typically gotten in with no second thought. That's why, despite using PEDs, Barry Bonds and Roger Clemens still receive a majority of the vote. But they have yet to get the 75% needed. And importantly, this is their final year. With that said, I do think doping is wrong and should be taken under consideration. And in the case of baseball, where there was a Wild West pre-testing era and a post-05 testing era, timing is relevant to many voters. Meanwhile, there are a lot of players whose connections to PEDs are a bit murky and difficult to verify. That's where we have to consider the important matter of the 2003 survey test. In 2003, all major league players were tested for steroids, and if over 5% were positive, a random punitive drug testing system would be put in place. This 2003 survey testing was not voluntary, as some have claimed, but it was meant to be anonymous. The point was to determine how many players were using. The problem was that the information was meant to be destroyed, but it was not, because in 2009 it was leaked that Alex Rodriguez, Manny Ramirez, Sammy Sosa, and David Ortiz tested positive in that survey. The first two names are not that important for this because they were confirmed as PED users later in their careers for other reasons and got suspended. For Sammy and Poppy, however, this 03 test is the only concrete link, and neither of them's ever admitted it or been caught. Since it wasn't punitive and there could have been false positives and such, and since he played many years after that without a positive, some writers give David Ortiz a pass for this. But they don't do the same for Sosa, whose entire prime occurred during the steroid era and who has arguably more circumstantial evidence against him. Those four names, therefore, are the only ones we absolutely know were positives on that list, but around the same time as those leaks, mid-2009, a page circulated on the internet purporting to have the entire thing. It could be the real list, but it could also be a deepfake. And I think so far people seem to have been operating under the assumption that it's not real, because there are some explosive names on here. So those four specific guys I mentioned earlier are the only ones we can confirm as 2003 positives. And even then, in 2016, Commissioner Rob Manfred went to bat for Ortiz by saying that there may have been false positives and it shouldn't tarnish his legacy. Alright, if you're still with me, I will help you out a bit by breaking things down as follows. I will give every player on this ballot a score from 0 to 5, indicating the certainty and severity of their doping. A 0 doesn't mean they didn't do it, it just means that we have no evidence against them at all. A 1 would be rumors, hearsay, this alleged 2003 tests, etc. Ortiz is a 2, a player with a compelling strike against him from that confirmed positive in 03. And a 3 is really verging on confirmed and a little bit more severe than a 2. There are 2 players on this ballot I gave a 4, meaning we are sure they heavily use steroids, but they did so before MLB's Day of Reckoning on the topic. And there are 2 players I gave a 5, which is the maximum possible egregiousness. That means they continue to use confirmed after MLB cracked down on it with testing and punishments. I think PED use was very common, and so I'm inclined to think all kinds of people at least tried it. But I'd say the 2 to 3 range is really where you get to the level that, yeah, he probably did steroids. Now, in the meantime, there are a bunch of players on this ballot with some sort of domestic violence or abuse allegations against them. 5. That's pretty disturbing. There's also Todd Helton with 2 DUIs, Roger Clemens, who had an affair with a country singer many years as junior, and Curt Schilling, who tweeted in support of the Capitol insurrection, and some years ago seemed to advocate the lynching of journalists. There are definitely plenty of players with these sorts of stains in the Hall of Fame, but there's never been a ballot with this many off-field problems to consider. The character clause does tell us to take this seriously, but what degree of single-instance wrongdoing should be enough to kick someone out the Hall of Fame? Is not fair, but sometimes these things come down to timing. If the charges against Andruw Jones had come out in 2020, as opposed to 2012, maybe his support would be crashing. I'm not sure if it's right, but I've generally not considered these things too heavily on my virtual ballot because I don't see much precedent for it and I believe in some degree of forgiveness. Gotta say, if there's a baseball writer out there who only wants to vote for unproblematic drug-free players, there aren't that many guys to consider here. That's how wide-reaching these issues are. So now, I will go through every player on this ballot, starting with lip service for a collection of guys who have no chance. There's a rule that any player receiving less than 5% is eliminated in the future, and that's definitely going to happen to all these guys. But they were all great players. Even just being on the ballot requires some degree of notable success. And here we have MVP winners like Howard and Morneau, along with Cy Young winner Tim Lincecum. Just because they're not Hall of Famers doesn't mean they didn't have phenomenal careers. Anyway, here's the fun part, where we talk about the serious candidates. I will give you a couple sentences on each one, but it's going to be rapid fire. So if we get to your favorite guy, feel free to pause because there's going to be a lot on these slides. Here we go. Bobby Abreu. Phillies outfielder with decent advanced metrics, but a borderline case at best with little star power. Barry Bonds. The most accomplished player since Babe Ruth and was always a Hall of Famer, but turned to steroids in his mid-30s to put up video game numbers, and is now in his last stand, probably the most controversial player on the ballot. Mark Buehrle, famous for speedrunning, in my opinion a bit short, both analytically and traditionally. Roger Clemens, almost exactly the same boat as Bonds except a pitcher. I made a video on him recently, you should go watch it. Todd Helton, Rocky first baseman who put up crazy numbers in the early 2000s but benefited from high altitude. A borderline case, but also a very trendy one. Tim Hudson, A's, Braves, and Giants pitcher who seemed on a Hall of Fame track early but didn't really keep it up. Torii Hunter, entertaining twin center fielder with a very old school case that breaks down a bit upon scrutiny. Andruw Jones, one of the most fascinating cases on the ballot, maybe the best defensive center fielder ever, but he had no longevity and his cases reliant heavily on retroactive defensive metrics. A lot of people have a lot of hot takes about this one. Jeff Kent, second base home run leader and the 2000 National League MVP. Not a great defender or base runner, doesn't have the highest WAR, but compelling candidate nonetheless. David Ortiz. As I mentioned earlier, this is a confusing candidate because he has a link to PEDs, but many writers are giving him a pass. He's a very beloved player with a big role in history, the only player on this entire ballot who has much chance of making it this year. Andy Pettitte, Yankees ace starter during their dynasty years, admitted using growth hormone a few times and hasn't gotten much support so far. Manny Ramirez, Red Sox playoff superstar and elite hitter who would be in by now if he hadn't tested positive, twice. Alex Rodriguez, possibly the worst PED offender in all of baseball, and that's saying something, but also like Bonds and Clemens was truly one of the best players of all time. If they can't make it, it's difficult to see a path for this guy though. Scott Rolen, the ultimate analytics candidate. Very high WAR, no links to PEDs or crimes, all-time great defender, very good hitter and base runner. Not the best counting stats though, and not thought of as a superstar for most of his career either. Jimmy Rollins, old school slick shortstop with gold gloves and stolen bases, analytically pretty far off but might stay on the ballot for a while. Curt Schilling, excellent regular season pitcher and maybe the greatest playoff pitcher in the LCS era, but he's a very vocal right winger and conspiracy theorist who has seemingly tweeted his way out of the Hall of Fame. Gary Sheffield, phenomenal hitter, not useful at anything else, but pretty strong statistical case apart from his connection to steroids. Sammy Sosa. Once upon a time, people absolutely loved this guy, but steroid suspicion and a lot of other controversies have clouded his legacy. He hit a ridiculous number of home runs, but otherwise was not a well-rounded player at all. Omar Vizquel. In my opinion, not a Hall of Famer anyway, but his candidacy has been completely upended by charges of domestic abuse and sexual harassment in recent years. And Wagner. All-time great relief pitcher, but over a very small volume. One of the trendier votes on this ballot, but still a few years away. Alright, that was a ton. So now it's time to take a look at what actually is going to happen tonight. As I mentioned, there's only one player on this ballot who has a good shot to be inducted. That's David Ortiz. He has a link to performance-enhancing drugs, but it's somewhat murkier than the one with Bonds and Clemens. He has an enormous role in the history of the game, so for better or worse, writers seem to be giving him the benefit of the doubt. What is the chance that Ortiz will be inducted? Probably greater than 50%, but I wouldn't say it's certain. Some projections have him over 99% to get voted in, and some others think it's a toss-up. The reason we're able to make guesses about who gets in and who doesn't before the announcement is the hard work of this fellow and his team. Ryan Thibodaux collects publicly released ballots and maintains a Hall of Fame tracker to see how candidates are doing throughout the whole voting process. Not all the writers make their votes public, but you can still get a good idea of who's doing well and who isn't. Some people think this is bad, because it spoils what's going to happen ahead of time. And with all due respect, I think those people are doofuses because no one in the world does more to generate interest in baseball during the dead of winter than Ryan Thibodaux. He does a great job. So what happens next? Well, unfortunately for Bonds, Clemens, and Curt Schilling, they are almost certainly not going to get in. Their fate is now in the hands of the Veterans Committee, and who knows if they'll even entertain the thought of voting for two guys at the heart of the steroid scandal. Of the remaining candidates, I'd say things are looking up for Scott Rolen to be inducted in the next few years, and things are trending up for Todd Helton and Wagner as well. As far as future classes go, the only compelling player becoming eligible next year is Carlos Beltran, but I'm not even sure he'll get in due to his connection to the Astros cheating scandal. 2024, on the other hand, is stacked, with a likely first ballot inductee in Beltre and strong candidates Maurer and Utley as well. 2025 will be the year of Ichiro. If I had to guess, only about half the players are listed here will actually make it, but I think they'll at least all stick around for a little while. Now, even if the writers don't induct Ortiz, there will still be plenty of festivities in Cooperstown this summer, as the early baseball committee elected two black legends of the game in Buck O'Neil and Bud Fowler, and the Golden Days committee elected 4 players from the 60s and 70s. I'd say the two early baseball inductees were richly deserving, and the Golden Days guys were a little more borderline, but I'm at least okay with all of them, and it's going to be a great ceremony. You should tune in. In the meantime, here are the 8 players that I'd probably vote for on the current ballot, although it's a very tough choice. Ortiz is a popular candidate for a reason. He was a great player, and his PED stain isn't that bad. I also believe Bonds and Clemens should be in, and I can't even think about A-Rod or Manny without them. I've touched on my reasons for that belief in this video and gone further in previous ones. I'm a fan of Rolen as a Hall of Famer, and I gave the nod to the analytics candidates Helton and Jones as well. Kent is a borderline case, but he's got 1 ballot left, and I think I'd throw a vote his way as if to say, hey, Veterans Committee, you want to induct this guy, go for it. And as far as Schilling goes, well, he actually requested his name be taken off this ballot after last year, so I don't see him getting in. But I don't think his insane views should diminish his baseball career. So anyway, thanks so much for watching. Maybe I'll make a recap video in a few days, and if you liked it, I always appreciate feedback and new subscribers. Have a good one.